Well, joining me now is editor-at-large at the Wall Street Journal, Gerard Baker. Gerard, thank you so much for coming on. Always thrilled to have you on, but particularly this week, because at the top of the show, I made a case that Marco Rubio, not JD Vance, is probably the best shot the Republicans have in 2028 to maintain both Trump's legacy while also driving forward an articulate conservative worldview that middle America will appreciate. And I note you've also taken up a similar theme in your latest Wall Street Journal column about whether Marco Rubio can deliver what you call the substance without the spectacle. Can you explain this choice here that the Republican Party has?
Well, thanks, James. Thanks for having me, and thanks very much indeed for mentioning the column. Yeah, I do agree with you. Look. This is as I said in the column, this in some ways is the kind of the essence of the conundrum of Donald Trump, right? I think it probably was necessary, given where America was, given frankly where the West was 10 years ago. It was necessary to have a really disruptive figure. The sort of traditional Republican Party leaders, though they were good people in many ways, they really weren't in touch with people's views on immigration, on globalization, on trade, even on the woke stuff. I mean, many of them were just too sort of tolerant of the woke stuff. So you really did need to have this dramatic, disruptive outsider come in. The question is, did you need to have all the other stuff that comes with Trump? And by that, I mean, some of the kind of slightly crazy tweets or truth socials or whatever, but also, frankly, some of the questionable character stuff. I mean, there's a long list of there's a long list of examples of grift going on right now from this administration. And so I think the challenge has always been, can you find someone who does what Trump does, makes the kind of impact that Trump has, overturns so many of these things that have gone wrong in this country over the last 20, 30 years, without bringing in some of that kind of baggage that people don't like. And I think to some extent that's an open question. Maybe you did need somebody. I give the example, James, of Europe. Trump, and that was where Rubio was. Would the Europeans really have done more in their own defense and committed to more defense spending and all of that if Trump hadn't behaved in the way that he did? Would they really have done that if they'd been asked politely and nicely in the way that, say, Marco Rubio would do? I don't know. I don't think so. So you do need an element of both. I just think right now that Rubio and the speech that he laid out in Munich and the way he kind of approaches things generally, I think he does give you that, the promise of change. Now he's changed himself. He didn't used to be in favor of a lot of these populist things, but I think he does. I think he gets it. I think he promises that, but without some of the other stuff. And I think he is a more appealing candidate, to your point. I think he is a more appealing candidate than JD Vance, who, frankly, while he's loved by the MAGA base and he says all the right things to the MAGA base, I'm not sure that he has the ability to reach out beyond the MAGA base in the way that Donald Trump, or I would argue Marco Rubio, can.
And, I really think it's interesting, though, that this speech has made such an impact that 5 or 6 days after he gave it, we're still talking about it. People are still talking about it. And my mail is that he got this big standing ovation. And my mail from Europe is that a lot of people, even though they won't say it on camera that they agreed with what he said and some of the tough love messages that he delivered, they agree with him and say that he was right about an awful lot of these things, and actually that they get what he's trying to say about this link between the Western great powers, Western Europe, the United States, Australia, too, for that matter.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, that as I said in my column, by 2015, when Trump came onto the political scene, there was widespread dissatisfaction with the world, but particularly in America, and it had been, Republican administrations, after all, brought us the disaster of the Iraq War and the sort of developing disaster of Afghanistan. And really, they also brought us to some extent the global financial crisis. All of those things happened on Republicans' watches. And on top of all of that, as I say, the Republican Party represented this kind of slightly weird hybrid between late 20th century neoliberal, kind of absolutely straight down the line Ronald Reagan economics, and 21st century sort of woke progressive embrace of globalism. And that was really a bad place for the Republican Party to be. Nobody back then in 2015, whether it was the leaders in Congress of the Republican Party, candidates for president like Jeb Bush, frankly, candidates for president like Marco Rubio, were offering the change that people wanted. Trump came along and brought that change. And, I think the 10 years later, the Republican Party leadership now basically gets it. They don't like a lot of what Donald Trump does, and frankly, nor do I. But they get that his message was absolutely necessary and that he was the one to deliver the change that people really wanted to do. Now, it's probably in 2 years' time, as the next election looms, it will be time to move on. And then the question is, who's best placed to carry that torch forward?
And, just on that torch question, too, though, one of the things that I thought fascinating, I said this before, about this speech was his real big love of Western civilization and those links. And the fascinating thing is watching how the left is reacting to this, because as you know, the left has tried to run down this idea that there's something special about Western civilization, basically as long as I've been alive. And, the latest cope on this, though, is this piece by Jamel Bouie in the New York Times saying that the civilizational link, I love this, between Europe and America is fake because, well, the founders of the U.S. made an explicit break with England. But come on, Gerard, all of those guys, they studied ancient Greek and Latin, and I mean, they modeled the Senate on ancient Rome. Anybody who drives around Washington, D.C. knows how linked Washington is to this thread of Western history. This whole Western civilization idea that Rubio is pushing strikes me as very threatening to the left.
100%, James. And of course, I agree with you completely. That argument is wrong. Look, there's a strong argument that's made and is made by serious historians that what was kind of defining and unique about the American Revolution 250 years ago was that it was fundamentally a conservative revolution. What they were revolting against was not, of course, it was monarchical power and the excesses of monarchical power. But if you go back and read all those documents, you read the Federalist Papers, you read all of the stuff that was written at the time, you read Tom Paine, they were calling for the rights that the English had for centuries back to Magna Carta. They were calling for, their beef with the king was that the king was actually not treating them in the way that English subjects did. The English had the English rights that had been achieved, and the way the English demanded to be treated, from Magna Carta through the Civil War, through the Glorious Revolution, and everything else. That's what was very much in the minds of the revolutionaries. They wanted to reestablish those rights. Now, of course, they wanted to do it in the context of a republic, and you're absolutely right. They drew heavily on ancient Rome and to some extent Greece, but that's those values that they were defending in the Revolutionary War and defending in the Declaration of Independence were absolutely rooted in those traditional Western values. To say English common law, English democracy, Roman republicanism, Athenian democracy. Those absolutely were the animating ideals. They didn't come over. They didn't have a revolution in 1776 because they wanted to change. They wanted to impose some sort of revolutionary new system on the world. They to actually assert the rights and values. That's what the preamble to the Constitution. That's what all those documents talk about are those inalienable rights, and those are classic These are Western ideas through John Locke and David Hume and so many of the great Western philosophers. That of course those are the common roots between the United States and America, and I would say obviously a country like Australia and other countries which have also gone their own separate way, but still cling to the values that the West actually first really adumbrated.
Absolutely, and that is why the American Revolution was a success and the French Revolution was a disaster. But maybe that's another conversation there. Yeah. Hey, before I let you go, though, I did want to talk about also, we've just had this opening meeting of the Board of Peace to rebuild Gaza. Now, there's billions of dollars pledged, but apparently there's still some rump area of Gaza that's under Hamas control. Just tell us quickly, how serious is this plan, and what do you reckon? Can this work?
Look, clearly it's a novel approach to this, right? So we've had the war. Israel has done a very effective job of causing significant setbacks, decimating really Hamas's military power. The standard way forward that American presidents have always sought at this point would be to say we've got to get buy-in from Arab countries. In order to get buy-in from Arab countries, maybe to normalize relations with Israel, we've got to go for a two-state solution. So because the Arab countries will insist on a two-state solution. I think Trump has kind of bypassed that. This idea of the Board of Peace is to say no, there's not going to be a two-state solution. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on actually what's needed in Gaza, not, we're not going to hand over Gaza to a political authority that's then going to, once again, try and declare war on Israel. What we need is what's needed there is investment. We really need to bring that to restore the Gaza Strip and all the damage that has obviously been done by the war, but also to build, to create the foundations of a functioning economy. And he's managed to get buy-in for that. I mean, we'll see whether these numbers actually materialize. The US is committed to $10 billion itself. It does that. But as you saw today, there are a lot of countries there who pledged their commitment to help this process along. So I think it's got a long way to go. We'll see how it unfolds. But this approach of saying, no, we're not, that the way forward is not some, elusive political solution of a two-state approach. What's needed is hard cash, and we are to put some up. These other countries are prepared to put some up. That's the way forward, and that will mean a more stable Gaza, a more stable Palestine, ultimately living, we hope, ultimately side by side with Israel in peace.
Yeah, well, the previous approach hadn't worked so well, so here we go. Gerard Baker, thank you so much for your time. As always, love the chat.